Hi there, in this tutorial I'm going to talk about how I created this scene. So the main element of it is I'm using motion capture data to drive an armature which then drives a fluid simulation. And I'll talk a little bit about how I created this interesting metallic material as well. So to begin with, we need the motion capture data. There's a number of different sites that you can get free data and others that you can pay for. Carnegie Mellon University has quite a number of short sequences, and I think the one I used here came from a Greek university. So to begin with, I need to import the animation. I've got a blank scene here. I'm just going to go up to File, Import, and make sure that you've got BVH available. If necessary, go up to Edit, Preferences, if you don't have the BVH import option available, and then just search for BVH here under Add-ons, and make sure this add-on is enabled, and that will allow you to import the BVH format. So we'll come up to here, Import BVH, and I have a number of animations here, and I'll use this one. You can see from the names they're all Greek. And with these particular files, they're quite large animations, so they take a little while. So it looks like nothing's happened at first, and then all of a sudden an armature will appear. And thankfully that armature covers all the basics that you need to show this animation. Now I'm going to put this up to 2,500 frames, and that's not even enough to cover this animation, but it's a good start. So if I now just scroll through, you can see we've got some things going on, and that's obviously doing an animation there. But if I press play, you can see it's all in slow motion. And that's just down to the nature of this particular motion capture animation. They've obviously captured at quite a high frame rate, probably something like 100 frames a second. And currently I'm displaying at 25 frames a second, so it's in slow motion. So we can adjust that. Obviously we could just animate our whole animation at the same frame rate, but generally speaking you don't want to do that. That's just unnecessary frames really. So I'll go to the dope sheet, and if I zoom in on a particular area, you can see each of these is a keyframe. So there's an awful lot of keyframes for this motion capture animation, which is a good thing really. It gives you a more accurate representation. Something to be aware of is there's no inverse kinematics or anything like that set up, so it's very much, at least in this case, very much a raw animation against an armature. So everything's already selected. If it isn't, you can press A to select it, and I'm going to press S for scale, and I'm going to say something like 0.4. so it's going to shrink the size, the distance between each of those keyframes, which effectively means it's going to speed the animation up. Slightly counterintuitive, and it takes a little while because, as I say, this particular animation has got an awful lot of keyframes in it. I'm sure what you could do is just cut off keyframes past the point that you want to use, and then this will be a lot quicker. So I go back to the beginning now and press play. You can see it's roughly a T-pose. It's, in this particular case, it's not completely. And you can also see nothing's really happening for a while. I think we get up to something like frame 300 and something before anything starts to happen, and then it's more like 500 before this particular animation starts to do something interesting. So we're getting up there now, and in fact it's even further than that. So there it is. It's probably still a little slow, so we'll speed it up a bit more. So we'll come up to here, hover over the dope sheet, press scale, and we'll go 0.8. So we're making it smaller again, which effectively means the density of the keyframes is higher, so the animation is quicker. So if we go about here, yeah, frame 800 now, you can see she's moving a little more quickly now. And at this point I could just cut off all the keyframes that I don't want. So much before about there, 955. But for the time being, I'm just going to say start at 955. And because I don't want this to be too long, we'll go up to, say, frame 1250. And let's just see what we've got. And you can see there's a little bit of standing around, and then the arms come up. We probably need to go further, so let's say 2500. So maybe we'll start at frame 1000. Arms come up, and the dance begins. And you can see there's a few little errors in there. You can see some of the knee joints are wobbling a little bit occasionally, but for our purposes that shouldn't be too much of a problem. You don't want too many glitches like that because you'll get a lot of problems with the water simulation, but for this is okay. So you can see we've got some movement there, and I think probably 2000 is enough. Next we need a mesh to work with. Unfortunately at the moment there's no way to quickly convert an armature to a mesh, so what we'll need to do is create one. So we don't need a very detailed mesh for this. You can use one if you want to. You can use a full human figure and then map that onto the armature, but it isn't really necessary. I just used icospheres. They don't need to be that detailed. One thing you may have is some difficulties in how the figure is angled, so what it might be worth doing, if I set this back to 0 for the start frame and go to the beginning, usually they'll have placed the figure in a more useful location for the beginning of the animation, as you see. So I'm just going to stretch that up and stretch it out a little bit. Now, how detailed you go here is up to you. For the tutorial, I'm going to go very low detail. I put slightly more effort into the demonstration, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my icosphere, go into edit mode, and then just duplicate some bits over here like this. Control L to select everything. So this is all one mesh, but it's in different pieces. I'm just going to change here to say individual origins, and then I can scale pieces down like that. Rotate X 90, look from the side. There's a head. Again, precision not too important because of what we're going to do with this. I just rotated that there. Created the arm from above, I thought as much. I'll rotate that a little bit to more closely match the angle of the arm. And then duplicate that. Go to median point, scale X -1. And then we can just move this over here. And I'm not even bothering putting shoulders on this one. And if you go to wireframe, you can get a better idea of where the armature is. So that's very roughly created the figure. Looks quite funny, but that's absolutely fine. We're not going to see this armature as such. I think I will just add one additional one, which is some hips, just to join these together here. So we've got our mesh, which is our figure. So we'll name that mesh figure. And we've got our armature. I'll rename that now. And now we need to join the two together. If we select our mesh, and then select our armature, Control P, and just say with envelope weights. Sometimes this will work well, sometimes it won't. You can start to test it by rotating and moving the armature in pose mode. So I just changed to pose mode up there, selected part of the armature. In object mode, obviously the whole thing moves around with it, but we can see it's not right yet. So select the mesh, and if we look at the vertex groups for the mesh, you can see it's created a lot of vertex groups. Most of them we don't really need. So in pose mode, we can select part of the armature, and we know that's left shoulder. I'll go to wireframe. If we select the end point here, we can see that's left hand. We can see it here as well. So we've got left hand, left forearm, left arm. So I'll go back to object mode and select my mesh, go into edit mode, come down here. If I find left hand and click select, you can see nothing is assigned to that at the moment. So what I need to do is click here, Control L, and just say assign. Then come to this one, Control L. We now select left forearm, assign, and so on. It may do some of this for you. It all depends on how well the macro recognizes which bit should align to which bone. And left arm is the upper arm, so we'll assign that there. And then we need to do the same on the other side. So this is now right arm. Just make sure I select it all. That's Control L, by the way, once you've selected a vertex, to select all the connected vertices. And this is the right forearm, and this is the right hand. So if I come out of edit mode now, select my armature and go into pose mode, there is a problem, but you can now see the arm is moving as you'd expect it to. The only problem is they're not aligned anymore. And I find this is just a bug in the way the armature's initially set up. So I've just been through each one for the initial position and done Alt R, which has removed any rotations, and I'll do that here as well. Then I'll come to object mode, go into edit, Control L, and just realign the arm where it needs to be, and we'll look from the top. You may or may not need to do this, it depends on the armature that you get. So you can now see, roughly speaking, we've got other problems, but the arms are now following the bones. So I'm just going to quickly go through and allocate more of the mesh to bones. So what I also had to do with the armature selected is just switch to rest position. You see you've got under the armature options, pose position and rest position, and really you need to set your mesh up in the rest position. Sometimes the initial position is the same as the rest position, so it doesn't matter, but in this case it wasn't. You do get a lot more buggy data with motion capture typically, unless it's been cleaned up. So having done that, you should be able to see now my mesh moves fairly well with my animation. So I've got my figure and you can see it's moving nicely. So I'll set the start back to 1000. So we can now just turn off the visibility of our armature, and in a little while we'll turn off the visibility of the mesh. So the next thing to do with the mesh selected is go up to Object, Quick Effects, Quick Liquid. Now, it may be a little difficult to see. I'm going to turn off floor and the grid, but we can see it a little better now. And you can see there's a figure moving around in a tiny little box. So the first thing I'm going to do is understand how much movement my figure does. So it's moving around, but it's not getting a lot of movement in the short bit of the animation that I'm using. So I'm going to select the box and just say scale up a bit, and then say scale Shift Z so it doesn't scale on the Z, and just take it up to there. So let's see if that, not quite, you can see we've got a bit of the figure coming out there. So we'll scale on the X just to enclose a bit more there. And we probably don't need to be that big, but what we do need to do is move it down a little. So that looks okay, that's enclosed the figure. I'm going to make it a little bigger anyway. In this case, I'm just going to add a cube, scale it up, scale down on the Z axis, and we'll just put it beneath the feet of our figure, something like that. We'll make sure the figure doesn't step off, and we'll check this axis. Seems to be okay. So if we go to our mesh figure and we go to physics properties, we can see this is now got a flow modifier, flow type liquid, and geometry. So all that means is it will create liquid wherever each of these chunks of mesh are. But that's not exactly what I want it to do. I want actually liquid to be flowing in. So I need to change this from geometry to inflow. So let's just see how that looks at the moment. Right now that's not doing anything, and the reason is because the cache for our domain hasn't been set up yet. So if I click the domain now, which is out here, so this is the liquid domain that defines where the liquid is going to be. It's at quite a low resolution at the moment. I haven't got a mesh set up yet, and also you'll notice the frame start is 1 and the frame end is 250. Well, our animation doesn't start till the frame 1000, so let's set that to 1000 and we'll say end of 2000. At this point I'm going to click is resumable, which means I can bake a bit of it and then go back and check it, and if it's okay, allow it to continue to bake. I'm also going to turn on mesh. You need to have liquid turned on or have baked liquid in order to then be able to bake the mesh. I'm now going to say all for the type, and you now notice we now get a bake button. And I'm just going to start the bake. The frame start went back to 250 for some reason, so we want 1000 there, free, and we'll say bake. So we'll let it bake a few frames. This is the bit that takes the longest if you're using Eevee to render it anyway. So we've got 100 or so frames there, so I'll press escape to stop it, and you can see we've got something happening. So at the moment fluid's falling down and then gathering in the bottom of our domain and starting to fill up, but it is working. If I go to solid view, you can see something's happening there. So at this point I'm just going to give a default color to the mesh so that we can differentiate it easily, and I'm going to go to the Eevee render engine just to simplify things. So let's just give it a bluish colour just so we can easily see what's what. So at this point I don't need to see my figure. So under my mesh figure I'm just going to turn off viewport visibility. Now obviously this is very low resolution. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to click this item here, which is our floor. We'll call it floor. And I'm going to go to modifiers, go to physics properties, say fluid, change it to effector and just leave it at collision. Go back to selecting my domain. This little cube here, by the way, indicates the resolution, as it were, the voxel resolution of our simulation. So you can see it's quite large. And I should have said as we went, you need to make sure you've applied scale, particularly to anything as you go, in order to make sure things work properly. So go back to my simulation, select my domain mesh. It will already be called liquid domain. Come down to physics properties and we'll say free, and you see we get our cube back, and then say bake all again. So now you can see it's respecting the floor. So the fluid is dropping down and then spreading over the floor and dropping down here. And if I just said resume, we can let it carry on from there. You've got some choices to make here. Do you want the fluid to fill up the domain as though it's a fish tank, or do you just want it to disappear? I just wanted it to disappear, so I actually changed a couple of settings. So if we stop that animation, you can see right now the domain's falling over the edges of the floor and then filling up an invisible aquarium. So if I don't want that to happen, I'm going to free the bake here. And by the way, you have to have saved your animation for this to work, but you can also define where it's going to put a bake, which you may want to do if you're going to do several different bakes, but by default it will just create its own folder. So you see we've got border collisions here. If I widen the window, you'll be able to see more of them. Front left, back top, right bottom, and I just turned them all off, which just means the fluid will pass through the walls of the domain and disappear because there's no domain out there. So it also should speed the animation up slightly because it's not having to render fluid that's fallen out of the domain. So if we have a look at that now, we've stopped a bit too soon, so I'll just say resume and we'll let that run. And you can see the fluids falling over the side and then just disappearing as it hits the edge of the domain. So now we can go to a higher resolution, which will mean it will take longer to bake. So I'm going to free the bake, come up to here. I use 256. Sometimes you will find it will crash if you go too high. 256 seems to be a reasonably good resolution. Bear in mind it's going to create a lot of files and it's going to take a long time to simulate. But for our purposes, I'm going to go to 128 and we'll see what that looks like. So that's quite a bit higher. You can see now that the little cube defining the minimum voxel size is there and it's quite small. So I'm going to stop the recording and come back when I've managed to simulate some of that. So here we are. I've baked the simulation at a moderate resolution of 128 divisions. It took quite a while, and if I press play you can see it starts to animate. Now it's still not producing fluid from all parts of the geometry. Partly that's because of the very crude geometry I've got, and partly that's down to the fact that the resolution of the simulation in voxels is still relatively low. As I said, when I did it I used 256. That literally took about 6 or 7 hours to simulate about 850 frames. There's a few optimizations you can do, such as minimizing the size of your domain and things like that, but it's still going to take quite a long time if you want a relatively high resolution simulation, which is what gives you the more realistic look of the water. So you can see he's got no shoulders. I did put some mesh here for the shoulders in my original animation, but I didn't do that with this one, so that's why there's a gap. Now you notice it's playing at a much more slow rate now. We're actually getting only 1 frame a second at the moment. And although I can't speed up the rate at which those frames are shown in the viewport, what I can do is encourage Blender to at least try to get closer to the full frame rate of 25 frames a second by skipping frames, just to give me a better impression of how fast things are moving and so on. So we go to playback. Instead of playing every single frame, I can say frame dropping. Now this is so slow that it's going to struggle and it's going to be jumpy. But if we now press play, what will happen is it will try to skip frames to approach the equivalent of 25 frames a second. It still takes it a second to display each frame, but it then skips enough frames that it'll be roughly 25 frames on from that. So it's jumping. And you can see that down here in the count. So it gives you a more general impression of how the animation progresses in real time, or something close to real time. And that's more noticeable when it's not quite as bad as that. And you can also see in the early part of the animation, it's able to play more frames because there's not as much water to simulate. But later on, there's a lot of fluid to simulate and therefore it takes a while. So if we just stop it there, let's just have a look at the material now. So first of all, I'm going to need to put a light in the scene, and I put a couple of lamps, but because we're using a very reflective material, I felt it was worth using an HDRI or something similar to an HDRI in order to illuminate the scene, because with shiny metal materials, for example, because they are mirror-like, or to a degree they are mirror-like, if you just have single light sources, much of the object will be reflecting the background, and if the background is black, then much of the object will be black, so it'll be quite difficult to see. But let's just put a couple of lights in the scene to begin with. So I'll just put my 3D cursor there, and then we'll just add a light which is a point light there, and I'm going to put that, I bring my camera up. We've got our camera buried in our object at the moment, so I'll bring my camera back to somewhere like here. We'll scale it up a bit. That's something I found using these pre-created BVH files, that the armature that came in with the BVH file was quite large, quite huge. Now you can rescale it, but then you may get into some complications, so I just used it as it was. So we'll just bring the camera back to there, and you'll notice because it is so large, we're immediately getting a clipping problem. So I'll just go quickly to the camera, and we'll just turn the clipping plane up. So something like 500 should be plenty. So I know where the camera is now. So if I go and select my lamp, this is going to be, at least initially, the lamp that we see as behind the figure. So I'm going to put it about here somewhere and somewhat above the character. and then I'm going to set it to a very high level, so 100 kilowatts. You see that 100,000 watts. That's very, very bright lamp. But I set the radius down to 0.1, so a very point light. We may want to turn on contact shadows. We can see later whether that improves the view or not. Bear in mind, we are in EV, so there are some slightly different settings to what you might see in cycles. So I'll copy that and I'll bring a lamp to the front. I'll bring this one much further down. I'll only have this one at 100 watts and I'll set it up to a much larger size. So it's a kind of fill lamp, or mix between a fill and a key light and the rim light here. If you wanted to follow the basic 3 light setup, you'd also have another light here which would be somewhere between the two in terms of size, maybe 0.5 radius, but would be quite a bit brighter than this fill lamp here. But because I'm going to mostly illuminate this scene with the environment, I'm not too worried about that. So if we go to rendered view now, you can see there's not a lot to see at the moment because it's a very reflective material anyway. So we'll just go to the world and we'll set that to black, and then we can see what we can see, and that's not much. Select my material. Now the default material that is added when you use quick fluid is actually a water-like material, and that's part of the reason we can't see very much there at the moment. So we'll go to the shader editor before I go any further, and you can see there it is. So I don't need this at all. I'm going to remove that. I'm going to remove the glass shader, and I'm just going to add a principled shader and just plug that into there, into surface, and now you can see what we're getting. I'm just going to turn that up a bit more. I think we'll go for 1000 watts. It all depends on the specific dimensions of your scene and things like that. And you can see I'm getting a bit of reflection there now, plus the bright rim light that we're getting from behind. And there we go, I've just pushed it back a little bit and it's illuminating a little more now. And as I say, you'd normally have a key light as well if you were just going with the 3-point light system. So what we'll do now is we'll add some more light to the environment. So we'll go back to world up here and we'll click use nodes. So all we've got is black there at the moment. So I'm going to add a texture which is an environment texture. And in my HDRIs, the one I ended up using because I liked the color and things like that from it was this one. So you can see it's an HDRI of clouds with some sun in there as well. Doesn't matter too much because we're not going to see this directly eventually. And then I can plug that initially straight into the background. And you can see there is our sky around there. By the way, if you're in orthographic view, as soon as I come out of the camera and if we go into orthographic view, the camera is always perspective, you can see the background doesn't map properly. We've just got the color of the background that varies a bit depending on where we're looking. We don't see it properly. And you can see that it is there when I look through the camera. So if you want to quickly shoot around without having to move the camera and see what the background's doing, just make sure you're in perspective view. Press 5 on the numpad. And now you can see the background. So you can see that's illuminating my figure, but as I've done in some recent ones, I'm going to make the background itself actually invisible. So I'm going to make a copy of that background and just put that there. And that's just the black background. I'm then going to add a mix shader, drop that there, and connect the black background to that. So now I can switch between the full textured background and black. And I need to be able to do that automatically, obviously. So I'm going to add an input which is a light path node, and then for is camera ray, that goes into the factor. And now you can see the object is still being illuminated by the background, but when we actually see the background, we only see black. And then I'm just going to turn the strength of the background down a little bit. We'll try 0.85, that's what I used before. And that's all I did for the background. So we'll go back to object shaders and we'll do some work on that. So just so that I can see things better, I'm just going to turn off the overlays and then we don't get that orange outline. So I'm just going to add a few nodes and then we'll see where we go with them. So I'm going to add a converter, which is a color amp. This is probably the node I use almost more than any other node. I'm then going to add under converters a separate XYZ node, or XYZ node, as I should say as I'm British. I'm then going to add under converters a vector math node and change that to normalize, which basically changes vector values, which could be, for example, 0 to 256 or even bigger values, to become 0 to 1 type values, which is what the majority, certainly in nodes, what the majority of our calculations work within. All of these are between 0 and 1, for example. And then I'm going to add an input, which is the geometry node. And I'm going to take the position output, so it's the position of any particular part of the geometry, and put that into here. This normalizes the value so that the X, Y and Z values vary only between 0 and 1. And then I'll take that into the separate X, Y and Z values. So literally they are now separated. I'm going to use the Z value, put that into my color ramp. So I now have some information which tells me how high in Z terms a point on my object is at any given time, and then take the color output of that into the base color of my principled shader. And you can see it's now dark at the bottom and light at the top. I'm then going to add another point. I'm going to come to this first point, make it relatively dark, and I'm going to make that one a darkish sort of red. I wanted it to also sort of fade out towards the bottom. I'm going to take the middle point and make that a bright orangey yellow sort of color, and then I'll take the top point and make that bright, slightly bluey white sort of color. And already we're starting to get something interesting going on there. I'm then going to take metallic and turn that up to 1. You can see that's now starting to look like metal that fades to sort of golden color down here. And I'm going to turn roughness down to a very low value. I'm going to go to 0.025. And now we've got a metal. I didn't really need to change anything else on here, and the only thing I tweaked was the color ramp itself. So in order to get a nice gradual shift from one color to another, I changed this to B-spline, and then I narrowed in these points a little, which gives me a sort of brighter silver up here. And you can then move this around, and you can see if I go further down, more of this area starts to become silver. And of course I can move this up if I want to, but I kept it fairly low. And that is all there is to that material. And you can see because of that HDRI, we've got some good illumination. And if you want to have a different way that that color shifts, you can go to ease, you could go to just linear, or you can even go to constant, and you'll then get just these sudden changes here, which I don't think look very good. But ease is not too bad, but I quite liked what I got with B-spline. So you can see if we go somewhere near the beginning of the animation, you can just see the sort of gold appearing down here, and most of it is silver. So at this point what I would do is go back to the physics properties, free the bake, and then bake it again at a higher resolution. 256 is probably the minimum to get a realistic fluid simulation. I cover some of the details of fluid simulation in some of my other tutorials, and I will no doubt revisit fluid simulations to go into a lot more detail, especially as the fluid simulation in Blender evolves and develops more capabilities. But you would need to free all and then rebake once you'd set the resolution to what you wanted it to be, and then just animate as normal, render to images for example. And the good thing is, of course, being Eevee, it renders quite quickly. So that took 1.5 seconds to render a perfectly acceptable image. Now you notice I've got my original mesh showing through there. So if I go up to my mesh figure, you can see that he's not disabled in renders. So I need to unclick that. Now be careful, if you unclick that before you do the simulation, I have had occasions where the simulation just ignored the mesh completely and I just ended up with a big cube. So only do that once you're ready to render. If I render again now, you can see it's disappeared. The armature won't show anyway, so if that's still visible, it doesn't matter. I didn't find I needed to even add denoising for this either. So I will upload my original file for my Patreon users to play with. I will put some links to where I found some of these motion capture dances in the description below. If you enjoy these tutorials, please click like and subscribe. It will help me out, and I will see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot.